This is Stanford Engineering's The Future of Everything, and I'm your host, Russ Altman. If you enjoy The Future of Everything, please follow or subscribe on your favorite listening app. You'll hear about all the new episodes and help us grow. Today, Professor Kathleen Eisenhardt will tell us that certain types of professional and personal decisions greatly benefit from simplifying. Turns out that a few, maybe 6 simple rules for decision-making can be much more effective than complex decision-making processes. It's the future of simple rules. Before we jump into this episode, just a reminder and request to rate and review the podcast. It helps us grow, improve, and it spreads the word about the future of everything. When companies make decisions about entering new markets or creating new products, there are a ton of issues that they have to consider. There may be a temptation to create a complex and hierarchical decision-making process to make sure you get it right. But what if you can make these decisions more simply by just using a handful of rules? Especially if you're entering markets or creating new products all the time, it could be beneficial to have some kind of pre-baked rules that you use to make those decisions to save time and resources. The frequency of these decisions might mean that you've accumulated enough experience that you don't have to go through a big process every time. Well, Kathleen Eisenhardt is a professor of management science and engineering at Stanford University. She studies marketplaces, innovation, business models, and technology strategy. She has concluded, and even written a book, that complex strategies are often counterproductive, and a few rules, maybe 6 sometimes, might be enough to make a lot of good decisions. And this also could apply to your personal life. Kathleen, you wrote a book called Simple Rules: How to Survive in a Complex World. Where did you get the idea for the idea of simple rules?
Okay, thanks, Rex. Thanks, Russ. Thanks for having me on the show. I got the idea. It was back actually a while ago where we were trying to understand product innovation and how do some companies get product after product that's successful and others just don't. And so we looked at several different companies, both here in Europe and Asia, and we found that some companies, you can be bad in several ways. You can be poor because you've got way too many rules and too many gates and too many steps, or you can be ineffective because you're just like winging it. And what we found was that the best companies were in between. They were like partially structured and partially not. So they might have a rule about, well, we only have 10 people on a team, but then they might mix up who's on the team. So we started realizing it was this middle structure was really what was effective. And none of the rules, although I'm in the engineering school and I'm a mechanical engineer and a computer scientist, I'm also an organization theorist and strategy person. So that's what I do. So none of our econ theories worked because they were too static. They just kind of didn't tell the story. So we went to biology and we found this idea of complex adaptive systems. And we said, wait a minute, that's what the good companies are doing. They're complex adaptive systems. And what that means is a complex adaptive system is a set of unique actors that are partially connected, trying to create some outcome. So a classic example is a jazz band. So you've got sax, keyboard, maybe guitar or something, and so they're different instruments, and they have some simple rules, like maybe the sax player always starts, and you only play your chords so long. So you have a couple of rules, but otherwise you just play. And that contrasts with the symphony, where if you're playing Beethoven's Fifth in half an hour, you're going to know exactly where you are. And so we realized that what these innovative companies were doing was they were acting like jazz bands, or they were acting like basketball teams, not football teams.
Right.
So this kind of emergent behavior. So that's where Simple Rules started.
So, okay, great. That's really helpful. So it came out of your core kind of disciplinary interest in organizations, innovation, companies.
Yeah.
How broad are the principles, though, in terms of can we apply them in our everyday life? Should we apply them? I know that you've told some stories on the internet and in some of your writings about a wide range of applications. And so how would you kind of define the scope of when this is appropriate? And I guess conversely, are there situations where you would say, no, don't use simple rules there. That is a whole different ball of wax.
Okay, first of all, they apply it in situations where you have repeated opportunities to do the situation. So, for example, they apply in dieting, like you might have some rules about I'm only going to eat vegetables or something like that. They apply. So they apply in your life, your dating life. But where they wouldn't apply is places.
Wait a minute,
where,
you said dating life. I can't let you just skip past that. Give me a couple of examples of simple rules that might work in dating.
Oh, in dating. Well, one of the
That's too good. It's too good.
One of the simple rules is if you're doing online dating, I do not start out, dear Russ or hi Russ. I say, hey Russ. Hey Russ is a really good simple rule that works. Other rules are more like idiosyncratic. Like I might decide that I don't want to date anybody who talks about their ex on the first date. Like that's like, no, I'm gone.
Gotcha.
Because they're not over it yet.
Please continue. I just couldn't let the dating comment go by.
All right. So the idea is that they apply to situations that repeat, but not. So, for example, you wouldn't have simple rules for getting married because you'd only do that once, or maybe twice, or maybe 3 times. But you don't do it like 20 times.
Right.
So you do it for things that repeat, both in your personal life and in your business life. So acquisitions, alliances in business, product development in business, hiring. But not a single decision like an IPO.
Gotcha.
That would be because you wouldn't do that often.
That's really helpful. So it's in your repeated and people, of course, in their lives, they know when these things are coming time after time again. What is the catch? What is the thing that goes wrong if they don't get simple rules in those kind of repeating situations?
Okay, what goes wrong is I can use a situation we all kind of relate to of we're trying to lose our midwinter weight, and so if you try to follow a complicated diet, when you're sort of tired or stressed, you give it up. Simple rules keep you on the path. So if you have a rule that says I'm not going to eat after 7 o'clock, or I'm going to use a smaller plate, or something that's just really simple, you stick with it even if you're tired, you're stressed out, whatever. So it tends to work. It tends to be effective when you do that. On the other hand, you don't want simple rules when there's really a bad downside. So you don't want simple rules for, aircraft checklists. You really want, or running parts of a nuclear power plant, or something where the downside is or surgery, like surgery with simple rules is not so good. You want to have, so when there's a big downside, because simple rules make mistakes.
So I must say that when I was reading about your work, it reminded me, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, there was another Stanford scholar, probably 100 years ago, I think his name was Polya, who wrote a book about heuristics in math. And it was about solving mathematical problems with kind of heuristics. And his idea of heuristics were simple rules in math that would get you to these solutions. And I'm pretty sure he had a Stanford connection. But I was smiling about how this idea continues to live. How many simple rules can somebody have for that activity before there's too many rules and it's no longer simple?
If you get over 6 rules, I think you can. I mean, how many? Basically, people can really remember 3 things. They're good at 4 things, pretty good at 5, but 6 is too many things. So I'd say 6 is probably the top of what people can really remember. Sure, you could write them down, but then it's not simple, as you point out.
Yes. So as we go back to the initial kind of inspiration for these rules, which was your work in marketplaces and innovation. How has the reception to this been? Have you tried to sell it to the entrepreneurs and innovators who might be making their life unnecessarily complex? And what are the kind of responses you get back? I mean, I'm sure everybody has strong opinions about how they like to do things, and I'm sure some people don't have simple rules. So how do you kind of sell this idea?
I sell this idea when I'm talking to entrepreneurs or executives who feel like they've just got so much going on that they can't figure it out. Like, I was working with one company. This was a biotech company, and they have a lot of different alliances because that's the way biotech companies work. And some of them were working and some of them were not. And they're saying, how do we know? How do we figure this out? Sometimes we have these great partners and sometimes it's terrible. So what we did was we went back to, let's make this simpler. Let's go back through a number of the alliances. Let's say your 10 most recent. Which ones worked? Which ones didn't? What would be the rules that would have gotten you, sort of working backwards? Here's the 6 that worked. What were the rules that would have gotten you to these and let you avoid the 4 bad ones? And so then people start to realize their own rules. Oh yeah, that's right. We were partnering with people who used to be good at but aren't anymore. Oh, maybe that's a bad idea. So you start to back into it. is one way. Certainly with executives, they feel overwhelmed. Life is too complicated, and say, wait a minute, how do I get control of this? And so you back into it. Or maybe you show them what other people are doing. Like there's a funny rule that Cisco had for a while on acquisitions. Was integrating the acquisitions, one of the first things you did was always change the vending machines, because engineers really care what's in the vending machines, and always buy new computers because engineers love new stuff. And so you could sort of say,
isn't that interesting?
So, that's what Cisco is. Oh, yeah, we could do that. It's, you think about how expensive is a vending machine compared to an acquisition. So you can learn it from other people. You can talk to your own people. You can look at your experience. You can read it in a book. But so that's how people get into it. They start to realize that it makes their life simpler, and they can go faster and do things.
So what do you tell them? Yeah, no, this is great. So what do you tell people about how bad should they feel about breaking a simple rule every now and then?
They should not feel bad. But if they keep breaking that rule, if they repeatedly are breaking the rule, it's probably a bad rule. They need to. Right. That's one of the signals that your rules aren't working anymore. Is if, like I had a friend who was playing poker, and he read a book, and he got kind of the simple rules of how to play, Texas Hold'em poker, and he was playing in San Jose, and he was only playing at the $2 tables, and he was really good. So he decided then to change it up and go to the higher stakes tables where the players are better. And the rules in the book didn't work anymore.
Oh, yes.
Now
I've had that experience with craps. When I go to Las Vegas, I like to play craps. I have some simple rules. They mostly work, but yeah, they don't always work. And I am no longer net positive in craps in Vegas.
Yeah, so you have to, if you're breaking the rules, you have to change them up.
Yes. Okay. So I'm really interested. I think people are. I think there's people who are thinking about this and thinking about how can I use this in my business? How can I use this in my life? And you just touched upon this, but I want to go back a little bit to like where these rules come from, because part of it, like in the Cisco case, you're borrowing rules that it sounds like that those were hard learned rules that somebody figured out like after doing enough acquisitions and thinking deeply about like what went well and what didn't well. If you're, do you encourage people to kind of try to use their common sense and extract out, like by induction, the kinds of rules that would have worked in retrospect? I think you made a reference to that before, because I could imagine people saying, yeah, I'm going to use these rules. And if they're terrible rules, they could be turned off to the methodology, even though it might not be a bad methodology. It just might be that they chose bad rules. Yeah.
And usually your rules are kind of simple. At first, if you just choose them, they're kind of simple-minded. But the idea is that you, particularly at the beginning, you sort of think about the rules, try them out. Especially if you're like systematic, the rules aren't working, you change them up. So we're working with some companies in Finland, and they were all trying to internationalize, and they would always go to Sweden next. It's like, we always go to Sweden, and then we always go to the rest of the Nordics. That was our simple rule. And then they realized as they thought about the rules, wait a minute, Sweden isn't always the best market. Just because they happen to be nearby doesn't mean they're actually the best market. Really, the best market for us is, a larger market with a bigger consumer base, or a more heterogeneous market where Sweden is just Swedes. So they started to realize, wait a minute, think more about not just the rules that we always had that we automatically did, to what really makes sense for our product and where do we want to take it.
Yes.
So people start out, but sometimes no. So people's initial rules aren't very good, and they tune them up.
So I wanted to ask, a lot of organizations, and I'm sure you know this, they spend a lot of time on things like mission statements or their value statements. These are the things we value in the company, or goals and aims. How do those things interact with the rules? Are the rules typically public? Like, if the management of a company has a set of rules, in your experience, do they usually kind of publish these to the company and to the workforce and say, hey, these are the rules we're going by? Or is it the kind of thing you use in your day-to-day management of your life or your company, but it's not so much for other people's consumption, it's more for yourself?
It's more for you and maybe your team or you're part of the organization.
Right.
But mission statements and value statements, they're usually just sort of fluffy, like,
Correct.
be good to your customers, send your mother flowers at Mother's Day. I mean, stuff like that, it kind of has no meaning. Simple rules, they can't be they can't be just platitudes. They actually have to be something that you're saying. Sometimes people have them and they don't realize it, so they're actually using them, but they don't know. But you normally don't see a big, like Salesforce doesn't publish their rules, but they might very well. I'm sure they have rules for their Salesforce on who to call on and how.
Right. In my field, in my research field, one of our journals started publishing 10 simple rules for X, where it was things like how to present a poster or how to give a good talk, and those were wildly popular. I'm sure you're not surprised.
No,
and people loved them, and they became one of the calling cards of this particular journal. The editor-in-chief was very attached to this idea, and it's really been and now there's probably 50 or 60 of them, and students all know about them. They all read them, and then I guess they decide if they're going to be using them. But slightly different, but not very different from what you're saying. This is The Future of Everything with Russ Altman. More with Kathleen Eisenhardt next. Welcome back to The Future of Everything. I'm Russ Altman, and I'm speaking with Professor Kathleen Eisenhardt from Stanford University. In the last segment, Kathleen told us how she got this idea about a few simple rules for decision-making and how it's caught on. In this segment, she's going to tell us that actually rules come in different classes, and some of those classes, like when to stop something and how to spend your time, can be the most valuable. She'll also tell us that there's such a thing as too many rules, and there's definitely such a thing as not enough rules. Finally, she'll tell us how machine learning and big data relate to simple rules. So Kathleen, I wanted to just start out asking, why, in the first place, why do people make things more complex than they need to be?
I think they make things more complex because they're trying to avoid a mistake. And so, like tax laws. It turns out with tax laws that you have more compliance if the rules are simple. But we're trying to sort of nuance everything. So you get a tax break if you're a real estate developer in Iowa, and you get a tax break for this and a tax break for that. And so you make all these complications because you're trying to fit every situation, or you're trying to avoid some downside. Instead of just recognizing that you're probably going to get better compliance if it's simple, because otherwise people won't get it. And you're going to get, and sure, you're going to make an occasional mistake, but that's kind of okay. So you sort of have to get used to the fact that, so if you try to control, for example, a really interesting, another one is travel expense policy by companies. You can have a zillion.
God, don't get me started.
I know. So you can have all these rules, but people have found, and there's research that says that if you actually just tell people, spend the money like it's your own, they get it and they do it. And maybe you have a rule or two about don't fly business class, but other than that, it's really just let people, sure, maybe some people will cheat you occasionally, but most of the time, most people won't. You
and I might have a common employer that we might want to bring these ideas to, but let's move on. Let's move on. So great. So I know that you've written about kinds of rules, and I think that's really interesting, that this is just not about kind of any old rules. You've actually kind of taxonomized them a little bit. So tell me what some of the big classes of rules that people should be thinking about might be.
Yeah, there's rules. Yeah, thanks, Russ. There's rules that are about choosing opportunities, choosing an acquisition partner, choosing a dating partner, choosing, and maybe how you do things like we were talking before, change up the vending machines. Those kind of rules people learn pretty easily, and they're valuable. People have trouble learning rules about how to stop something. So it's easy to pick. It's easy to have rules, stocks to pick. It's hard to figure out a rule of when do I sell. Stopping things, or stopping. You're working with a graduate student, and that graduate student's just not working out. Rules for stopping that relationship and how to do that in a gracious way. Time rules are another one. So stopping and time rules have a disproportionate effect on performance, but they're harder to learn. So time rules like only do 5 new hires a month, or something about time, or something to do, or enter a Western European market before you enter an Eastern European market. So things that have to do with sequence. So sequence and time rules, time and stop rules are hard for people to learn, but they've got a lot of value. So
yeah, it sounds like that they're specifically valuable. It sounds like you've studied this and that those are the ones that can sometimes help pay the bills.
Yeah, and certainly picking the right opportunity and executing it with simple rules, that's really important. But people kind of get that fast. It's the time and the stopping that you have to think more about, and yet they're unusually valuable.
And so that actually is very interesting to me, because now you're kind of suggesting that you need to look at your rules as a portfolio. It's a portfolio of rules. And if you're too heavily weighted in one area, like things to start, but you don't have enough rules about things to kill or to stop, that might be a problem. So first of all, I want to ask you, do you take a kind of portfolio approach? And also, how big should the portfolio be? Because I know you've also written about when there's too many rules or not enough rules in this portfolio.
Right, and we were talking before about 6 is a good number, is about all you can do. If you have a portfolio of some starting rules but some stopping rules in that portfolio, maybe the portfolio gets a little bit bigger if you add stopping rules, because you kind of think about it stopping at a certain time.
Right.
But yeah, you do think about the starting rules, the how-to rules, the time rules, the stopping rules. And those are kind of, and there's priority in there too, but I don't want to get it too complicated.
Yeah. So, but give me a couple of sentences on priority, because that sounds interesting.
Oh, priority would be something like hire people who've got graduate degrees from a certain set of schools and have a GPA of a certain number, but give priority to people who are eccentric.
Okay.
If you've got you've got a zillion, computer science people from Carnegie Mellon, then within that pool, okay, I actually look for the ones who are eccentric, let's say, which was kind of was a Google rule.
Right. So, okay, so I want to ask you, I know you've been using machine learning in your work, and that's actually a little bit surprising to me, because this sounds so kind of down home and simple, and I can keep 6 things in my head even as I grow old. But whereas we all think about machine learning as big data and a lot of complications. Yeah. So make that link for me. Why does machine learning wind up being helpful to you in these kinds of discussions?
Yeah, well, what it turns out, there's actually really a synergy. I'm a lot of the work that I do is actually really small data, like case studies of 10 or 12 somethings, and then seeing what's going on. And what you do when you do that, you get let's use the problem of the unhoused that we have in California. Someone like me would go and do deep case studies of probably 20 people, and really understand why they were there, how that was happening, what sort of thing was going on. But then I might also use big data to make some predictions about who's likely to be homeless, or what kinds of solutions are going to be most effective for what kinds of people. So I would, on the one hand, get the sense of the problem and the mechanisms and maybe the different pathways. And on the other hand, I could use the big data. I could seed the big data with what I found out in the field about mechanisms or different kinds of people. Put it as part of the set of variables in the machine learning algorithm. And because you already know something about the problem and you have some insight about it, you actually don't need millions and millions of data points. You can do it with a smaller data set. You can even find things, you can have data sets more like on the level of 5 and 10,000 to corroborate. Yeah, so you don't have to go to massive data if you actually have some sort of understanding of the issue.
So in that case, you had you did your case studies, you generalized to a few potential rules, and then you kind of checked them on the big data to see if they hold up over a larger scale. Can you go in the other direction? Have you ever seen machine learning come up with a rule that is simple?
Well, it depends upon, in machine learning, you can tune the model so let's say you put it in 100 parameters. And actually, well, that's, by the way, I didn't say this part, but if you're driving with cases, you also put in a bunch of other variables just to be sure that you aren't, cheating on the model. But you can go the other way.
Predetermining the answer.
So you put in other variables too, just so. But if you go with the machine learning, what you can do is essentially use regularization and say, okay, there's 20 variables that are predictive, and in many situations, there may be 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 variables that are predictive, but there are often only about 5 or 6 that really matter. And so
Yes.
what you do is you essentially use what's known as regularization, which just says, I'm only going to take the big effects.
I'm very intrigued by this because, as I'm sure you're aware, one of the big issues in AI models these days is the explainability, and some of them are very difficult to explain because they've used millions or thousands of variables to make the decision, and then when a human decision maker, like a doctor, that says, "Why did you recommend this drug?" or "Why do you think the patient has this disease?" What they really want is the top 2 or 3 reasons why this is probably the right drug, and what they don't want is a full description of the model of every little detail and how it contributed to the decision. So in a funny way, your simple rule model is interacting very well with this idea of explainable AI.
Yes, absolutely. And it's saying, particularly when you're using AI and predictive AI, in a situation where you're interacting with people like doctors or like judges or like executives, you want to have typically it's more valuable to have a smaller number of rules that people intuitively understand. Oh yeah, I get why that could be true. On the other hand, if what you're doing is you're running A/B tests to see whether or not black or blue screens are working, if it doesn't really matter,
right,
and you're doing a lot of A/B testing, you don't have to understand the model. But if it's a model that's about that people have to use it and are not confident. A hiring model, again, you might crank in a hiring model and it's blah, blah, it's got zillions of variables, but people don't feel good about that. They want to see the 4 or 5 or 6 factors that mattered. And does that fit with their value system? Does it fit with their intuition?
Great. Well, we only have about a minute left, but I do want to ask you, I did review a lot of your resume and on Google, and I saw a reference to the Eisenhart method. And I just had to ask you, what is the Eisenhart method?
If you've been around long enough, it's a term some other people coined. But I created a distinctive style, in the sense that I often look at problems. I try to look at cutting edge problems where we don't know the answers, and go look at deep case studies between about 6 and 12. And there's a method about how you actually analyze it. And one of the interesting things actually about the methods, it's basically it's a multi-case method is what it is.
Okay.
And then you try to induct a theory for multiple cases, which is a pattern recognition problem. And what was stunning to me when I learned machine learning is algorithmic multi-case theory building. So the method that we were doing in the small was what algorithmically machine learning was really doing.
Yes.
And I said, whoa, that's exactly what we do in our minds.
Fantastic. And now we know what we should call it. It's the Eisenhart method. I love that. And I'm glad I asked, because it actually ties up things very nicely. Well, thanks to Kathleen Eisenhardt. That was the future of simple rules. If you enjoy the podcast, please consider following or subscribing it so that you will receive news of future episodes and never be surprised by the future. Maybe tell your friends about the podcast too, and definitely rate and review it. We have more than 200 episodes in our back catalog, and so go back and check them out and see what you can learn. You can connect with me on Twitter at RB Altman, or with Stanford Engineering at Stanford ENG.